Okay, that was amazing. Absolutely amazing. Next up, we have Arne Blankerts, who's going to talk to us about PHPUnit 10, the new event subsystem. So Arne is a long-standing contributor to PHPUnit and part of the PHP consulting company, the php.cc. We've been at conferences together, and we've had good conversations around these things. And I am actually particularly interested in this, although I've been really interested in all the talks today. Actually, the talks today have been really around tools that the community are using hard. So this really fits into the day. But I'm very interested in this talk to see about the new event subsystem in PHPUnit 10. Arne is a prolific open source contributor and maintainer of open source projects and development tools, presents at conferences, and loves to read fantasy novels and likes to cook. So let's welcome to the stage, Arne. Hey, how are you doing?
Doing good.
Firstly,
awesome to be back at the conference.
The first question I have to ask everyone today is, how badly did I butcher my pronunciation of your name?
Actually, it was pretty good. Depends a little bit on where in the world you are, how the name probably is commonly pronounced. In German, it would be Arne, but
Arne.
I'm been traveling around the world, so I'm pretty used to all kinds of variants. It's Arne, Arn, either is fine. I got used to, pretty much like Stefan said earlier, I'm used to all kinds of variants. I'll probably react if it sounds somewhat familiar.
That's all good.
All is good.
That is all good. How are you doing? It's been a while since we hung out. So how's things with you?
Well, busy actually right now. As you know, we are running around as consultants. Usually we are traveling a lot to be at clients. Now with all the restrictions for obvious reasons, we had to do everything remotely, which in the beginning was really hard because nobody was really prepared to do that. By now it's a lot easier, and we actually have a lot of things to do and are currently, for whatever weird reason, a lot of firefighting doing. Project rescue kind of things like, hey, we are stuck at this position here, or this stuff doesn't work, can you help us? So there's a lot of stuff to do, which is fun. And to me, very interesting how quick things changed. I mean, in the beginning, we were like, yeah, giving access to our source code. Yeah, can you come on site and maybe use our hardware? So we are not going to give that out to anybody. And now it's like, yeah, well, here's your GitHub invite. Just download the code if you need it.
Yeah, it's
quite a turnaround.
People can be flexible when they need to get stuff done, right? So that's all good. I'm really excited to learn about this PHPUnit 10 event system. So I'm going to let you get on. So thank you very much,
yes.
Anna, and we'll speak to you at the other side.
Yes, thank you very much. Okay, so this is a live presentation because I'm too lazy to pre-record things, and mostly in this case particularly because we are actively working on it, and everything I would have potentially pre-recorded like a couple of days or even worse a couple of weeks ago would have been completely outdated by now, so I would have to be redoing it like so and so many times. So I figured I'm going to do this live to actually be able to incorporate all the latest changes and fixes that we might have introduced already. So let's get started. So a quick introduction in case that wasn't enough yet. I'm part of a consulting company called the PHPCC, or the PHP Consulting Company in full. And usually we travel around in the world to help all kinds of teams to make better software, make reliable software, and first of all, produce the right software, not just the software right, but figure out what is actually needed and what needs to be developed. And as part of the things, of course, we have a lot of testing to do, and having Sebastian Bergmann on board in our company probably leads to the side effect that we're pretty focused on testing and quality in general. So the talk before was very interesting to me as well. I learned a few things that I didn't know on what Simon can do, but maybe I can show you a few things that you didn't expect PHPUnit to be able to do. So let's have a quick look on what we're going to discuss today. And even though the talk is titled to be about the new event system, we have to go back in time to understand why and where this actually came from, and why do we even need that? Or maybe want that. So back in the days, and I'm not sure if anybody is long enough running with or in the world of PHP to actually know PHPUnit 2. I actually checked, it's like the copyright header says 2002 to 2006, so I don't know exactly. At one point in time, Sebastian probably can put some light or shed some light on that in the chat. But that's really a long time ago. And back then we had what is still available as of today is the TestListener interface. And while you can see that this is potentially a quite large interface having various methods, it covers everything that you would assume you might be needing to see what's actually happening while running tests. And while that makes a lot of sense to allow whatever kind of extensions or even internals of PHPUnit to register for that and see what's happening, to produce nice output, to generate logs, whatever kind of things you might consider relevant, you're going to realize that the API already, well, of course, it didn't look like that in PHPUnit 2 because back then we didn't have the types like void and things like that, but the general infrastructure and the general API looked pretty much comparable like that. But we have objects being passed around, particularly the test object, and that's not necessarily very practical. And it took probably just a few years, but even a few more years to finally decide to actually do something about it. So back in 2019, when the world was still okay, Sebastian wrote that he definitely now needs to get rid of TestListener because it allows more than just listening, which seems to be a practical thing for quite many frameworks out there that are following their own kind of logic on how to do things. And for PHPUnit to work with that particular logic, they have to, well, let's say, change some of the internal workings of PHPUnit, and for that make heavily use of the capabilities of the TestListener interface, which always leads to interesting side effects and probably very annoying bugs on both sides probably. But from the PHPUnit's perspective, having an interface and an API that may lead to the effect that the application breaks is usually a very problematic kind of thing. So if you see how, like, even on operating system levels, people try to create layers around the driver so that even if the driver screws up, the operating system still stays afloat. Having the same kind of, well, separation, if you will, within PHPUnit would be kind of nice. So this interface needs to go. And there's also, of course, a solution to that, or at least it seemed to be a solution. There's the TestHook interface that Sebastian introduced. And that basically tried to fix everything by creating some marker interfaces at first, and then allowing you to, well, basically create a set of interfaces that only do the exact same thing as the TestListener interface before, having individual interfaces now for pretty much every method that you saw before, but changing what's actually in there. So instead of passing around potentially large objects, but even objects that PHPUnit uses internally so that you could modify or change any kind of calling, whatever kind of things you might do with these kind of objects, this is all removed and you just get very simplistic things. Seems nice, seems powerful enough for quite some cool things. There's, for example, one extension that I think is very interesting. That's the speed trap, where you can see like, okay, I'm going to run all the tests like normal, but I'm going to report everything that took too long, whatever too long might be in your configuration, so that you can report on that and potentially act whenever you think you have time to address the performance issues on the testing level. Okay, now what seems like a small jump into a completely different direction, but it's actually related. You're going to find out in a bit why. One of the most common log formats that pretty much every platform supports is either Clover XML or JUnit XML as the log format for pretty much anything that is unit testing. The only problem with that is that it's not actually a standard, because while many people are seemingly relying on it, if you try to research, and Sebastian said he spent literally hours talking to various people even to figure out what the official JUnit log format would be, there's no specification, and there are seemingly various variants, and some people extending it into that direction, then some other format doing something different. So it's really hard to figure out what the actual log format for JUnit XML should be. And since PHPUnit tries to be nice and play with all the other nice tools out there, particularly all the things that allow you to render nice interfaces based on the test results, creating dashboards, coverage reports, whatever kind of things in a generic fashion, those tools need a generic format. At least that's what we assumed. But since there is nobody actually in charge of defining that, we at some point decided, you know what, we've been doing PHPUnit for like years, and we're trying to tell the world, let's agree on a standard. But everybody seems to be like, yeah, well, maybe or maybe not. But we at some point figured, we just create our own format so we can specify all the details that we care about, not having to skip on information that others can't handle just because in their world it's either not interesting or they don't have any means to actually produce it because the framework in use can't produce those values. So we figured we are going to create our own log format that allows to specify and output all the details that we can possibly gather if we want it to be that verbose, so that we can get more insights on what is actually happening while we're running our tests. And one reason why those insights are so important for us, it's particular as consultants when seeing tests being executed, like, okay, this is taking long, or the test suite in general is slow, or there are various errors happening at various points in time. It's really hard to manually look through all the information that you get. So having a system that can report that, potentially writing it in a format that is actually parsable, as in machine readable, would be very beneficial. So the question is, how do we do that? And funny enough, the EU had an interesting project, the EU Fossa 2, that's free and open source security audit, I believe, was what the characters stand for, which is a EU-funded project to use open source within EU organizations. And to make sure that those actually work and are reliable and are secure, they funded gatherings and group meetings so that people can actually make the software better in the interest of the EU as an open source support kind of thing. And PHPUnit was invited as one of the projects to take part of this EU Fossa 2 event. And we sat together, and this is actually the initial discussion that Andreas Möller, Ewout, and me basically were having on how to actually implement our new logging mechanism. And you might see I'm talking about logging and data that we want to have, and not really about events yet, because for us, the idea that we need something else for logging was the actual driving force. We did not try to implement something new as a subsystem just to have a new subsystem, or to actually do something that's different from what the TestTalks, for example, provide, but to get all the output or the data that we want to create a new nice log format. And that was actually the task, if you will, that Sebastian gave us when we were sitting together, like, hey, we decided to do this different type of logging thing. So please have a go. Let's see if we can hack something together during this workshop days. So we did. But we pretty soon realized, and I hope that is actually visible, like I highlighted a few lines in there, that the TestHook interface was designed to be minimalistic, as in do not add any information that could be used against PHPUnit, so if you will, could be abused, could be used to do any kind of weird things so that PHPUnit internally would have issues to continue. which is a problem for us, because as cool as the test hooks seem to be, for our logging goals, they were too minimalistic. We did not get all the details that we cared about. So back to test listeners. No, we needed something better. And while the approach of the test hooks already was to break things down into smaller components, we figured actually encapsulating the data into standard kind of objects that we can then use as a message kind of thing would make most sense. And like a couple of minutes after we came up with the idea, it's like, actually, this is pretty much what event systems are being designed for. And events are immutable, so they represent something that just happened. You cannot change it anymore. So you're not even running the risk of somebody subscribing to that particular event and being able to do any kind of weird changes, because the only thing that is still possible is basically deal with the fact that you now had this kind of event showing up. So it happened, deal with it. So sounds cool. So maybe events is what we want to do. And we spent some time discussing if we can create a generic event, or if we need an event kind of hierarchy, saying, okay, this is a test has been executed kind of event, and then having subclasses describing that it was a success or a fail, or why it potentially failed. Is that, again, a subclass? And realizing, actually, this is too much. We're going to make it simple and create the individual things that we think those are the things that can occur. And if they are related or not is a detail that might be visible by the namespace or by the grouping, but is not actually a hierarchy that we want, because that makes things complicated, because it also would have the chance that you would deal with basically double type of events, because you have to emit the event of one type or the other, or listen to both, and then it's a mess. So let's try to make it simple, make it quick, as in make it fast, make it run stable, and produce all the data that we want in a read-only kind of fashion, not allowing any kind of writing back to PHPUnit, so not affecting the actual runtime behavior. So thinking about it, what we want to do, we wrote a few events. Then we wrote a list with more events and more events. And at some point, we ended up at 45. That's 45 different types of events that PHPUnit, as of right now, can already emit. I'm quite sure this is not going to be the end of it. There's likely going to be a lot more, but this is a pretty complete set for everything that's more or less a standard run of things. We already discovered a few things where it might be practical to add another event, but we'll see if we implement that for 10.0 or if that's going to be added later. And just to give you an idea how the 45 events might look like, this is just a tree output from the source directory of PHPUnit 10, where all the events are listed. So we have a group for assertion. Right now, there's only made as the event in there. There's the bootstrapping part. There's, of course, extension handling. This is certainly going to be extended because loaded and initialized or things like that might be interesting. We have the global state handling. So if you have the unlucky situation that you have to deal with global state and have to back up it and restore it, that's the event that will be emitted for that. And of course, we have all the test things and all the reasons why tests might actually have failed. And yeah, there's a lot more, and there's a lot more. And yeah, so there's quite some events going on. So to me, that was like, okay, now we have a nice means of creating or encapsulating the events. Every event, of course, will have all the information that we, at least at the point in time when writing this, considered relevant. So you will get telemetry information. You're going to get all the relevant parts. For example, if the test failed, you're going to get the message that failed. You're going to get the assertion that was used, all kinds of things that are relevant for that. Of course, that needs a lot of documentation still to be written, but that's a different story. And since I just mentioned it, telemetry is something that I considered very important because, as I said in the beginning, for us, understanding why things are happening and how long it potentially takes from one test to another or from one cert to the other is relevant to measure. So we added telemetry info to pretty much all the events. So every event gets the current time in terms of runtime, so it's an HR time. So even if you modify the actual system clock, this will not be an effective means to change the performance impression. So you cannot cheat around. It's using HR time, the PHP core function, for that to determine how long it took. It's going to calculate the duration. It's going to check the memory usage, and yeah, add that as a object or as an information to every event. So we can make a nice bar chart, and I actually created a nice line graph already just by creating, well, storing the information here in numbers and then having, yeah, a plotting library added to see like, okay, where's an outlier would take longer for whatever arbitrary reason. So you can analyze what happened at that point in time, which is pretty powerful, I think. Another cool thing for, of course, not all events, but for all the events that are relevant, where it is relevant, you get a class instance along of the test value object, if you will, which contains all the, as I just described as an example, the metadata and information that is relevant. For example, the class name, the method name, and so on. And you get the metadata, which is also completely new, which Sebastian wrote like, well, a couple of weeks basically ago by transforming the doc block annotations and the new attribute annotation style and creating a meta API around that so that all the data that is being annotated for a test is now available here as well. So in the event, you don't have to parse the doc block yourself anymore. If you want to deal with all that stuff, you get a nice, clean object that provides all the information that PHPUnit was able to parse from either annotation or attributes. So now that we have a nice interface in general to get data, we need to be able to actually get these events, right? So that's cool to know that we have these things, but well, I already mentioned you have to subscribe somehow, but how do we do that? And that again was actually quite a long discussion and some various iterations of implementation trying to figure out what feels right and what proposes or supports a clean design. And for that part of the implementation, we actually forked PHPUnit to my private, or not private, to my own repository under my name on GitHub and developed there a little bit in private because we didn't want to have that many people arguing and fighting while we are still trying to figure out what we actually like and what we consider a good approach. So in that semi-hidden repository, we created various approaches. If you check back in the history, you can see that we changed a lot of things back and forth until we figured out that this is the way we want it to be. So, of course, if you want to get events, then you have to subscribe. And while that looks like a pretty much standard thing to do, we have a facade that we implemented around the whole event subsystem, which allows to register a subscriber. The way you have to do this may seem a little bit verbose, but for us, that ensures that the use of the event subscribing mechanism and the whole internal processing means is clean and advocates nice design as we consider it nice design. So I'm interested in finding out whether people agree or not, but we'll see. So what's so special about it? We decided to create dedicated interfaces per event type. So for pretty much every event type that we had before, we now have a subscriber. So you cannot, by definition of that type of approach, have one class that implements the subscribe to more than one type of events, because you cannot implement that same interface, because we decided explicitly to create an interface that uses the same method name all the time, because it's always notify. So with that kind of approach, we need something like this to actually make it work with, if we want to have more than one type of event that we can handle. We create, if you will, a forwarding or mapper class that gets the event and then passes on the relevant aspects of that event to the actual shared whatever kind of logic thing. In this case, I have a generic shared logic thing where I can add the constraint from the made assertion event. So if I would have to have more than one event type that I care about, I would have to create a new class doing exactly the same thing for pretty much every type that I'm interested in. Now, many people say like, yeah, but now I have to create so many classes. Well, yeah, maybe you have to. But on the other hand, it's not really much more code than you would have to do if you would be able to implement more than one interface here, because the method that you're creating is the same and the rest can be generated. So there's not really that much that is actually redundant work, particularly if you just inject the shared logic here. That class can be pretty small. It's easy to test. It has a very clean interface and a very clean API. And it's isolated. So if you want to create something new, you just add something new. You don't actually have to modify an existing class. So all the traits and all the ideas of object-oriented programming, this is what we believe so far. Well, not necessarily advocating, it's technically even enforcing what we consider a clean design. Okay. I can literally hear, even though I'm not looking right now, that people are, but what about if I want to have all the events? Well, good question. Simple answer, register a tracer. So we are, of course, aware of the situation that there will be cases where you care about 4, 5, maybe 6 types of events, and everything else is irrelevant to you. That's actually what we assume to be the majority, or the other extreme, caring about all events being the other extreme. But that's the two things that you're going to usually have. There's hardly a chance that you care about a big bunch of events, because at least for now, we couldn't foresee a use case for that. But if you care about a whole lot of events, of course, creating all the individual things at once and registering them individually doesn't make sense. So we implemented explicit means of registering a tracer. A tracer is something that basically gets all events, no matter what type. So for that, the facade also offers a means of registering a tracer. Not very surprising, I guess, on how that would work. And yeah, I think the most interesting thing to see on how this actually works is to see how we do that in actual code. So Sebastian and I already worked a little bit together on making the, actually I think Andreas helped as well, making this new tracer available, because the current debug implementation is not necessarily seeing all the details that we consider relevant for debugging. And since it doesn't really allow you to stop and be interactive, as what I would assume a debugger is supposed to be doing, we figured it's actually just tracing. So we're going to see what's happening, and based on the event stream, the text output might actually make a lot of sense. So this is something that's being created as a new means of seeing what PHPUnit is doing internally, if you care about all the details, just as a more or less fluent stream. And basically that means, again, this trace text option only exists in PHPUnit 10 in the master branch so far. You have to specify that as a flag and or as a parameter, and specify a path where you want to have the output. So if you run it, it's just going to start doing things, and at some point it's hopefully done. and then outputs. Well, if you look at the file, you can see there's a lot of to do still. So this is definitely all under construction and not fully completed yet. But this is the first generated output of all the tracing systems. So you can see that we started the test runner, the bootstrapping is finished, and took, well, 0.0.0.067 something seconds. So it's actually pretty quick. Then the test suite has been loaded. Sorting takes a little bit of time. Then the event facade is sealed. That's also an interesting thing that I'm going to explain in a second. Then we have the test suite actually started. So this is now where testing actually starts to be testing and not just infrastructure setup of PHPUnit internally. And then we have the first test being prepared, and we have our first assertion made, which checks whether or not a certain exception is being thrown or not. So that's the very low level output of what PHPUnit is doing based on what the events are being currently emitting, and simply serializing that to a text format right now. So the interesting question is this ready to release? And the answer, of course, is no, it's not. That's why PHPUnit 10 is not out yet. We have a few issues left that are marked on GitHub right now. This is not really something where stuff is not necessarily working per se, but it's just stuff that we want to change. So actually make use of the events, that they're just not wasting CPU cycles for no apparent reason. Sebastian already is actively working on changing the JUnit logger to use the event stream to output basically the same information as before. We're going to address the other logging things as well. And then finally, I'm also going to be able to create our own log format, which is of course going to be a whole beast in itself, trying to define how to serialize all the data that we get in a meaningful fashion and not dying in redundancies of information. For example, if you have like the global state event, then of course the global state itself is going to be included, but of course you don't want to dump the whole global state into a variable, into XML or JSON or whatever kind of format, because that's just going to be megabytes of data if you keep doing this various times back and forth. So we have to see on how verbose we are going to be. But before I go into more details, let's quickly go back a little bit. Because I mentioned that there's this event facade sealed event in here. We decided that there's going to be a nice chicken and egg kind of problem in pretty much every system, actually, where you can tell, like, okay, I want to register a means of listening to events, either as a subscriber or using a tracer. And all the events that happen before that I actually managed to subscribe. And we implemented a mechanism in PHPUnit, which is a deferred dispatching that says, okay, when we start PHPUnit, then we're going to collect all the events up to the point where we consider, okay, by now, everybody who would be interested in subscribing to events must have been registered, because either it's an extension or it's PHPUnit internal. Then we can seal the facade, and by then we can send off all the events that have been gathered, and then from then on just directly dispatch them, so we don't actually have to consume more memory than needed to keep all the events back in memory, but we can directly dispatch them to the actual, well, subscriber or tracer. So as you might have seen, this is still under heavy construction. We have a lot of stuff going on that we also plan in terms of features. One of the things that we didn't really consider on how to do that yet is allowing extensions to emit their own types of events, which would be interesting if you have like various applications that, or extensions then working together. You have something that emits events and you have some other extension that deals with these events, but that needs a very stable API to actually make any kind of sense. So this is something for like maybe 10.1 or 10.2 or maybe even at 11, because we want to make sure that we have a working event system first for all the internal users, and then allow people to subscribe to our events, and then allow custom events to be emitted as well. Right now, the code does a lot of things in a hard-coded fashion, and let me quickly switch over to that code. So we have a lot of nice methods in our facade to ensure that we have only known subscribers and known events. Quickly close this. So here are the register subscriber and register tracer methods, and we have the seal functionality, which does the flushing of the events. And yeah, we have a type map, and here's our default event list of all the events that we currently allow and know about. So if we're gonna have custom events being able to be added, the API in general is somewhat already there, but it explicitly is hidden behind like the facade in a private fashion, so you cannot really mess with it yet, but the infrastructure is in place. We have the type maps for that, and we can yeah, add additional things once we decided on how this API thing is supposed to look like. What I really like is the metadata thing being included, because I think that's really practical to have annotations, even custom annotations that may not have any meaning to PHPUnit itself per se at some point. So we can extend this as well, have additional information made available via the events by custom annotation. So there's a lot of potential to add more things and provide more data. Let's go back to the slides. Some of the issues in here, of course, contain a lot of work. One of the things that is for me, and probably for Sebastian as well, a big showstopper right now to release this is that if we have child processes running, for example, if you do stuff in process isolation, then all the events emitted there, of course, need to find their way back to the parent process. So this is something we definitely have to implement yet. So that's not there yet. So right now, if you want to play with the events, you're of course free to do that, but that's all in no process isolation, because the events will not necessarily make it back. Other than that, yeah, I guess I'm about done with that part. Maybe I was a bit quicker than I expected, but I guess that's okay. So I'm open for questions in case there are any, because I did not look.
Something's gone wrong. Again, today is one of those days. We lost Arne. But it's all good. I can see a lot of good conversation in the chat about how this is going to work. So yeah, there's a small problem here. What we may do is, if we can sort this out, is to no, it died for everyone, Kath. You're all right. What we may do is we can probably go to the break early and then come back from the break early if we can get Arne back, because I know there's a lot of questions that people want to ask about this. It's incredibly interesting to me, and I'm sure it'll be interesting to a lot more people, and there's a lot more conversation we wanted to have. Oh, here we go. I just waffled on long enough to fix the problem. It's all good.
I have no idea what happened. StreamYard kicked me out after like starting like the spinning circle for a while, and they're like, oops, something happened. Please reload.
We've had problems, but they've all been like incredibly pertinent parts, because like if we're gonna have a problem, when you finished your presentation is the best time, right? So it's all good. It's all good.
So I knew it's going to be problematic, so I rushed a little bit, because I think I was a bit quicker than I originally planned for. But
that's the way to do it. That
gives more time for questions, I guess.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions which we can just run through quickly. So, yeah, will it be possible to register events programmatically? Alessandro asks.
Yes, it will be. Right now, it's not. But we have a facade right now that, of course, can only emit our types of events. But as soon as I said, we are going to open up the whole API for custom extensions, for custom events, and for custom subscribers. That's all going to be part of the deal because that makes the whole system worthwhile. So
yeah, I can imagine
yes.
it will be. Yeah, that would be incredibly powerful. Yeah, that's interesting. My mind's racing now with things like that. And another question is: will the new log standard be completely new or different from JUnit, or will it just extend JUnit a bit? Or
to be quite honest, I have no idea how that's going to look like yet. We have a lot of information that is not going to be something that JUnit or any of the other log formats are expected to have, because we are including like the telemetry information. We're going to include the metadata wherever possible, and we're going to have a lot of information based on the events that we can put into a log, while like the JUnit log format, for example, is of course focused on the individual test and the test suite and like that very concept, but everything around that is not covered. So if I would want to log, like, for example, how many mock objects I created or how long it took to create them, or how long it took to create a database fixture or these kind of things, how would I put that into JUnit? That doesn't work. So we're going to have to create our own format. If that is going to be an extended version in some way, or it's going to be completely different, I have no idea yet. We are in the very beginning of that phase. As scary as it may seem, for us, it was important to have the infrastructure in place to actually be able to get all the information and then decide what information we're going to put into a log file and what is just like data that is for tracing or any other monitoring tools that you might employ.
yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. Obviously, there's a lot more information being passed around now than previously. So, yeah, that does make a lot of sense. Yeah.
We might actually end up having like a verbosity kind of flag where you can say, okay, add all that stuff or just add a little bit of it, or be as restrictive as you want to. The cool thing is that once you have the infrastructure in place with the tracer, you can easily create your own logger. I mean, if you check the source code that we have right now, and there's a branch for the JUnit XML based on events. That's a couple of hundred lines in total, I would assume. It's still work in progress, but it's based on the events. You can create any format you want. So if the format is not the way you want it to be, it's comparatively easy to create that. And in contrast to from before, where all the logs have been generated at the end, so PHPUnit had to keep all the data in memory and then run all the individual log processing things sequentially. This is now based on events, so it happens at the point in time. So even if you want to send it, for example, by a socket to your logging daemon, just making this up now, then you could do that, right? So you could basically integrate that with Tideways, if you will.
Yeah, there's a lot of flexibility this gives, right? I can totally see that off the top of my head here. The other question that raises its head for me is that this is going to be quite the headache for third-party extension developers, I would imagine.
It depends on what your goal is, right? If you want to get information from PHPUnit, this is going to be heaven, because now you get probably a lot more than you bargain for. Yeah. If you're trying to modify the behavior of PHPUnit, then of course this is going to be more like hell, because the event system is going to take all the means of modifications away. And as mean as it may sound, that was exactly the intention, because we have so many issues where third-party extensions or wrappers modify behavior of PHPUnit. Then Sebastian implements some change, or we implement some change, if I may say we in that case, and then of course break that whatever kind of wrapper that deals with or messes with PHPUnit internals, and then it's our fault that whatever Symfony can't test anymore. And that's not the way we want it to be. And if you follow the solid principles, well, the O says you should be able to extend but not break things. Well, if you have a means of breaking things, then obviously your API and interfaces aren't necessarily clearly designed or clean designed to prohibit that from happening. And
yeah,
I'm not sure if we need all the people extending or changing internal behaviors, or if there's other ways of doing that. Maybe we have to come up with better implementations for them as well, providing them custom APIs to do that. But the test listener hack, as I would actually like to call it, is certainly not the way to go.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, this is going to be a lot of breaking changes, right? But it's going to be a lot of breaking changes in the trade-off being it's like resetting to a solid foundation for the next 10 releases of PHPUnit, right?
Yes, I would certainly assume so. The thing is that the test listener interface has been deprecated for I don't know how long. I think almost since I know Sebastian, it's like, I have to get rid of this one. And so this is definitely not a surprise to the community in general, I think. The test hooks, I think, and maybe Sebastian can correct me in the chat, if that's wrong at least, they were never really marked as like, this is actual final. This is more like work in progress kind of thing. And well, maybe it was not perceived as an experiment, but to me it always was like, okay, this is our first approach of doing something else. And then we realized, okay, might hurt a few people, but changing the test listener to, if you were actually only listening to the events, should be easy. Changing the test hooks that by definition could only listen should be even easier, because basically all the information that you had is still there. It's just maybe one more method call to actually get that information from the actual object or the actual event. So the breaking changes, if you separated the things properly, and that's what we are trying to enforce with our means of creating the subscribers, should actually be not a big deal.
Yeah, makes perfect sense, right? And if you're watching and you haven't been following in the chat, there's been some excellent links posted by Sebastian and Andreas and other contributors with links to like some of the code you were talking, some of the work in progress code you were talking has been posted there as you were talking about it. So it's definitely worth looking in the chat if you're interested in seeing, for example, the example of the JUnit XML logger Sebastian's posted. So catch up in chat if you're interested in this kind of thing. And it's also worth mentioning, as Sebastian said in chat, that PHPUnit 10 will be PHP 8 minimum, right?
Yes.
Awesome.
Definitely. That was actually a very helpful decision, because funny enough, we planned on having like the event system in earlier and kept pushing it because we saw like how much work would be after actually implementing the events itself. And now that we are at PHPUnit 10 and like, okay, the point in time where we probably going to be able to release that, the only main sensible version of PHP that is supported by the PHP project would be 8. So deciding to make that PHP 8 and up makes a lot of sense. And again, people might not like the fact that things are changing all the time, but I think that's how the IT world is. And for PHPUnit to support various versions of PHP that are not even supported by the PHP community in general anymore is quite a burden that I don't think makes a lot of sense for most people. There might be edge cases, and I discussed that with various people, Juliet being one of them when he was ranting about all the issues for WordPress, but that's a different area. Let's not go there.
Let's not go there. I agree. we could talk about that for hours. Catherine in chat asks, in the Q&A asks, is there any way that we can provide help going forward for PHPUnit 10?
Yes, sure. We, as you might have seen in the tracer output, for instance, have a lot of events that are just converted to string. So pretty much every event has a asString method. And for every event where you just saw the to-do in the line, basically is, well, a dummy implementation for the toString. So that's just a lot of work, not necessarily very complicated work, but it contains decision making, right? I mean, to serialize an object structure into a human readable string, which is of course the point of the trace log, is not necessarily as simple as it may sound. If it's just like a bunch of strings that you get as the values for the event, that's probably easy. But if you have a nested object, then you have to decide on how to serialize that and represent that, how to group things potentially together, or where to cut them off. If you were to, for example, create your own custom VARDAM kind of implementation, if you were trying to do that for whatever weird reason, then you of course have to keep in mind that there might be recursions in there, so you don't end up in endless loops and things like that. So there's work. So that could definitely be done. And of course, a lot of testing. I mean, even though we create tests for all the events, the whole event subsystem in general, of course, needs tests and needs testing. And yeah, so that's the most important thing where I guess we can use help right now. If somebody feels obliged to create or help transforming whatever kind of log mechanisms, we have various log formats that are currently implemented the classical way. They could also be converted into using the events. So that's also something, if somebody feels like, yeah, I want to do that, I showed the list of issues where all the log formats were listed. If one is missing, feel free to add a ticket for that and label it accordingly. And maybe raise your hand like, hey, I would like to actually give it a go. And we can totally discuss that in PRs back and forth. If you're not comfortable at directly creating it, we can give a hand, no worries.
Sounds amazing. And yeah, I noticed there's the GitHub issues has a good first issue tag as well. So if you're interested in getting started in open source and you'd like to start with something gentle, then there's a tag for that. And I mean, PHPUnit has been, one of the pillars of PHP development for I don't know how long now. Certainly since I've been doing reasonably good quality coding. So yeah, it's a good place to give back. So I don't think we have any other questions. Arne, if there's anything else you want to say, otherwise what we will do is say thank you so much to Arne. Thank you to Sebastian, who's also in chat, and on the team of contributors for an amazing tool and a really interesting peek into what's coming up in PHPUnit 10. It's intriguing to me, and I'm sure other people there. So thank you very much, Arne.
Well, thanks very much for having me. And just to stress the point very much again, even though I was the one presenting here, of course, this has been a group effort. I was not the only one writing this. Andreas Möller and I created the majority of the source code, but also Ewout created quite some valuable input and feedback while discussing things. And of course, most importantly, Sebastian, who merged it and then with me together fixed various side effects and issues that we, of course, overlooked while implementing it, despite having it tested. So it's a group effort. So whatever is there right now in terms of events is not just my work. Might have been my idea to do it, but certainly the major amount of work is not just by me.
Awesome. Thank you again, and we'll see you soon.
Again, thanks for having me, and sorry for potentially running a bit too quick right now, but
it's fine.